The midday sun blazed over Fort Bragg, one of the largest military bases in the United States. The asphalt shimmered. The air smelled faintly of sweat, coffee, and steel polish, the perfume of soldiers and long hours. Inside the compound, the mess hall buzzed like a hive. Forks clinked against metal trays, boots scraped. Voices rose and fell in bursts of laughter, and somewhere at the center of it all sat a circle of seasoned troops, confident, loud, and entirely unprepared for who was about to walk in. At precisely 1300 hours, the door swung open. Every head turned, a reflex in a place where timing and posture defined respect. Through the doorway stepped a woman in crisp uniform, her name tag catching the sunlight. Callan. Her brown hair was neatly tied back beneath her cap, her face calm, unreadable. She paused for a moment, scanning the room, not to challenge anyone, but to understand everything. The silence that followed wasn't out of respect. It was curiosity. Then came the whispers. "New lieutenant?" Someone muttered. "Yeah, from the officer training school. Looks like she's never seen the field," another said with a smirk. Laughter followed, low and rolling, the kind meant to sting without being direct. Sarah Callan didn't react. She grabbed a tray, moved down the line, scooped mashed potatoes, and poured a thin stream of gravy that barely covered them. Her movements were precise, economical, a kind of control that only comes from years of habit. She sat alone in the corner, her eyes on no one and everyone at once. Across the room, Sergeant Mason leaned back in his chair. He was broad-shouldered, mid-30s, the kind of man who'd seen enough tours to think he'd seen it all. A scar ran down the side of his face. Afghanistan, maybe Iraq. He studied her with a lazy grin. "Bet she's here to teach us about equality," he said loud enough for his table to hear. His friends chuckled. "Or maybe she's the general's niece." More laughter. A spoon hit the tray beside Sarah's mashed potatoes. She looked up briefly, meeting Mason's gaze from across the room. He expected anger, maybe embarrassment. But there was nothing, no twitch, no glare, not even a blink of annoyance. Just calm. It unnerved him for a second before he laughed again to cover it. Sarah took her time with her meal, finished, and quietly left the hall. No words, no glances back. But inside, she wasn't unaffected. That night, in her small office adjacent to the logistics center, Sarah sat under the dim light of a desk lamp. The walls were thin. Outside, she could hear the clatter of boots, bursts of laughter from the barracks, and the distant whir of a generator. Her laptop screen glowed pale blue. On it were personnel rosters, duty logs, and a long list of training violations, missed drills, shortened exercises, incomplete readiness reports. The base looked strong on paper. But Sarah had seen enough to know strength wasn't always visible in reports. It was visible in reactions, in order, in discipline. And today, she saw cracks everywhere. She opened a notepad, scribbling notes with her military pen. Security rotation week at Gate 3 response time to alert slow, observed 1640. Mess hall behavior, lack of respect and order. Commanding officer, Mason, lacks accountability. She stopped, sighed quietly, and leaned back. Her thoughts drifted briefly to Bagram Airfield, where she'd served as an operations assistant during her early years. She remembered being the only woman in a team of 12, the constant second-guessing, the jokes, the invisible wall between respect and resentment. Back then, she had learned the truth that defined her career. Authority isn't granted. It's earned in silence and proven in chaos. The next morning began with roll call. Rows of soldiers stood at attention as the sun rose over the field. Sarah walked past them, clipboard in hand. She didn't bark orders, didn't shout. She observed posture, uniform condition, reaction time. Some soldiers straightened at her approach, Others rolled their eyes once she passed. Mason, as expected, stood relaxed, chewing gum. When roll call ended, she addressed the unit. "Good morning," she began. Her voice was calm, but carried. "I've reviewed the last 3 months of training reports. This base has a readiness score of 81%. That's above average. But in combat, average is what gets people killed." The soldiers exchanged glances. Mason smirked openly. "With respect, ma'am," he said, "this isn't a classroom. We run the base fine." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm sure you do, Sergeant. But fine isn't good enough. Not when the enemy doesn't care about your schedule." The group quieted slightly. "Tomorrow," she continued, "we'll be conducting an unexpected readiness evaluation. No notice, no script. I want to see how you perform under real conditions." There were groans, muttered curses. Mason stepped forward, half grinning. "Is that an order, ma'am?" "It's an opportunity," she replied, "for you to prove how fine this base really runs." The conversation ended there, but the air around them shifted. That afternoon, she visited the communications center. She studied the outdated alert system, the reliance on manual triggers, and the fact that drills were announced days in advance. Predictable, easy. She met briefly with Lieutenant Rhodes, head of security systems, a man in his 40s, tired and compliant. "I'd like to schedule a level 3 simulation for this base," she said. Rhodes blinked. "Without approval from the commander?" "Consider this training initiative," she replied evenly. "I'll handle the paperwork." He hesitated. "The men aren't used to surprises. You'll cause panic." "That's the point," she said quietly. Back in her quarters that night, Sarah stood in front of the small mirror, untying her hair. For the first time, the fatigue showed, not physical, but emotional. She thought of her father, a retired Marine who taught her how to shoot before she could drive. He used to tell her, "Respect isn't about volume, Sarah. It's about presence. The moment they doubt you, make them remember who commands the silence." She turned off the light. Tomorrow, she would make them remember. The next day unfolded normally. Drills, paperwork, lunch. Mason was laughing again in the mess hall, recounting a story from his last deployment, surrounded by half the platoon. The sound filled the space, easy, careless, loud. Sarah entered, same calm face, same quiet step. The laughter dulled briefly, then resumed. Mason leaned back, smirked, and raised his cup. "To our fearless new leader," he said mockingly. A few soldiers chuckled. Sarah took a tray, ignored him, and sat 2 tables away. She glanced at her watch. 13:47, right on time. At 13:50, the first siren blared. The mess hall went still. Then came the second, louder, longer. Soldiers froze mid-bite. A voice cracked through the intercom. "Base security alert. Unauthorized breach detected at south perimeter. All units respond immediately." Forks clattered. Trays hit the floor. Mason stood abruptly, confused. "What the hell?" Sarah rose, calm, voice sharp. "Move! This isn't a drill." But it was, only she knew that. Within seconds, chaos replaced chatter. Soldiers sprinted, bumping into one another. Orders overlapped, voices clashed. Amid the noise, Sarah's commands cut through like a scalpel. "Alpha Team, secure Gate 3. Bravo, set perimeter. Mason, take 5 men and cover comms." Mason blinked, startled at her authority, but obeyed. For the first time since she'd arrived, the entire base moved to her voice. That night, the simulation results showed a 68% failure rate. The soldiers who mocked her were exhausted, embarrassed, but alert. They understood now that calm didn't mean weakness. It meant control. Sarah reviewed the report, alone in her office. A faint smile crossed her lips. She'd promised herself she wouldn't demand respect. She'd make them feel it. And this was just the beginning. The following morning, Fort Bragg was quieter than usual. The echo of the previous day's drill still lingered in every corner. Soldiers walked with tense shoulders, and for the first time since her arrival, Lieutenant Sarah Callan felt the weight of her presence ripple through the compound. She'd tested them, and they knew it. Some respected it. Others resented it. Whispers followed her like shadows. Did she really trigger that alert on her own? One asked in the corridor. She did. Nearly gave Mason a heart attack. Another laughed. Mason himself, however, wasn't laughing. He sat in the outdoor training yard, running a hand across his jaw, replaying the chaos in his head. His pride had taken a hit. For years, he'd been the man soldiers looked to for calm and authority. But yesterday, he had hesitated, and she hadn't. That hesitation burned in him more painfully than the embarrassment. When Sarah crossed the field later that morning, clipboard in hand, Mason's gaze followed her. She caught it, met it briefly, and nodded once, neither friendly nor cold, just professional acknowledgement. It stung him more than mockery would have. In the command office, the senior staff was already dissecting the event. Major Henderson, the acting base commander, was a stout man with a deep voice and little patience for disruption. "You ran an unscheduled simulation, Lieutenant Callan," he said, folding his arms. "That's not standard procedure?" Sarah stood at attention, her expression calm. "No, sir. But standard procedure is exactly what we needed to test." "And it failed?" The room went silent. Across the table, Rhodes, the communications officer, cleared his throat. "She's right, sir. Our average response time was over 7 minutes. If that had been real, we'd have lost the perimeter." Henderson frowned. "Next time, I expect notice. You're new here, Lieutenant. Learn the rhythm before you start changing it." "Yes, sir," she said evenly. "But with respect, sir, rhythm doesn't matter if it gets people killed." He stared at her for a long moment, then dismissed the room. The other officers filed out, and Henderson leaned forward. "I read your record, Callan. Impressive. Combat training, top 5 in Leadership Academy. You're good on paper. But these men don't follow paper. They follow strength." "I'm aware, sir," she said. "Then earn it the hard way," he replied, his tone softening slightly. "Not through drills. Through them." She saluted, turned, and left the room. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. She knew he was right. By the end of the week, the whispers had evolved into open challenge. Soldiers followed orders, but with hesitation. Mason, now cautious, kept his distance, but others found courage in his silence. During one weapons maintenance session, Corporal Dines deliberately slowed his work, glancing at her to see if she'd react. When she finally called him out, "Corporal, your rifle's not inspection ready," he shrugged. "With all due respect, ma'am, we've been doing it this way for years." Sarah crouched beside his workbench, picked up the rifle, and examined it. The bolt assembly was half cleaned, the chamber residue still thick. She turned the weapon around and handed it back. "You've been doing it wrong for years," she said quietly, and walked away. The room fell silent. Later that afternoon, Mason found her at the shooting range. She was alone, hitting target after target with clinical precision. He waited until she emptied the clip and said, "You made your point the other day, but you're pushing too fast." She didn't look at him. Too fast for who? For the men. They're not used to being led by someone like me. She interrupted. Mason hesitated, then sighed. "They just need time. You caught them off guard. You embarrassed some of them." "I didn't embarrass them," she replied, reloading. "I exposed their comfort zone." She fired again, Clean, centered shots, each one echoing like punctuation. Mason watched her for a while, arms folded. "You think discipline comes from fear, Lieutenant?" She lowered her rifle and turned. "No, Sergeant. Fear fades. Respect doesn't." He met her eyes, steady, unreadable, and for the first time, he didn't have a comeback. That night, the barracks buzzed louder than usual. Someone had printed a crude sketch on the notice board, a caricature of a female officer in uniform, holding a hairbrush instead of a rifle. The caption read, "Base Barbie, she commands with hairspray." Laughter echoed through the corridor. Sarah found it later that night when she was making rounds. She stared at it for a long time, expression blank. A few soldiers nearby went silent when they saw her. She took the paper down, folded it neatly, and tucked it under her arm. The next morning, training started an hour earlier. At dawn, fog clung to the field like a curtain. Sarah stood at the edge of the drill yard, stopwatch in hand. "Today, you'll be running obstacle drills in silence," she said. "No talking. No shouting. You move as a unit, or you fail as one." Groans rippled through the formation. "Move," she commanded. They ran. Over walls, through mud, under wire. The silence was brutal. No encouragement, no laughter, just breathing, grunts, and the rhythm of boots hitting dirt. Halfway through, Dines slipped, falling face first into a trench. Mason reached to help him up, but Sarah called out, "No." "He gets up on his own." The soldiers hesitated, confused, but obeyed. Dines pushed himself up, spitting mud, glaring at her, but finishing the drill. When it ended, they stood before her, drenched and exhausted. She scanned their faces. "That's what strength looks like," she said softly. Not laughter, not comfort, endurance. No one spoke. Later, Mason caught up with her near the operations building. "You're turning the base upside down," he said. "Maybe it needs to be," she replied. He frowned. "You're not wrong, but you're making enemies fast." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's all right. I didn't come here to make friends." She walked away, leaving him standing there, thinking about the quiet certainty in her voice. For years, he'd led men through chaos with shouting and strength. But there was something about her silence. It demanded obedience in a way words couldn't. As the week ended, Henderson called her in again. "Word is, you're getting results," he said. "The soldiers are sharper. The reports are cleaner. But I'm hearing complaints too. They think you're running this place like a boot camp." "Then it's working," Sarah said simply. He chuckled. "You've got steel, Lieutenant. Reminds me of someone I knew in Iraq." He handed her a file. "There's a leadership assessment coming next month. We'll be observing you closely. I want to see how far you can push this base without breaking it." "I understand, sir." She took the file, saluted, and left the room. But her mind was already elsewhere. That night, the storm outside rattled the window panes. Sarah sat in her office again, lights low, reviewing logs and readiness data. Every statistic told a story of laziness turned to focus, of defiance turning into discipline. But she knew she wasn't finished. The soldiers might have started following her orders, but they didn't believe in her yet. And belief, true loyalty, had to be earned through something real, something they couldn't ignore or dismiss as a drill. She set her pen down, looked out at the lightning cracking across the Carolina sky, and whispered to herself, "Next time, they won't just obey me. They'll trust me." Outside, the base was asleep, unaware that the woman they once mocked was already planning the event that would redefine them all. The test was coming again. Only this time, it wouldn't be a simulation. The week stretched long and heavy across Fort Bragg. Days began before sunrise and ended in silence. Every soldier moved sharper now, every drill tighter, yet the tension in the air was thicker than ever. Rumors still lingered like cigarette smoke. Some said Lieutenant Sarah Callan was on a power trip. Others swore she was secretly assigned by higher command to spy on the base's performance. Few, if any, believed she was simply a soldier trying to lead. By Friday morning, the whispers had sharpened into open defiance. At breakfast, Mason overheard a group of soldiers joking near the coffee machine. "Bet she's got a camera in her office watching us," one said. "Nah," another replied. "She's too busy polishing her medals." Mason didn't laugh this time. He stared at them, something unreadable in his eyes. "You'll eat those words soon enough," he muttered, then left the hall. That afternoon, Sarah stood in the control room with Lieutenant Rhodes, finalizing her next move. On the screens before her flickered maps of the base, communication grids, and emergency response routes. "Are you sure about this?" Rhodes asked, nervous. She didn't look up. "Completely." He hesitated. "After the last drill, the commander told you to hold off. You'll cause chaos again." "Chaos," she said quietly, "reveals who's capable." She picked up the intercom headset, typed a code into the alert terminal, then paused. Her eyes drifted to the photo on her desk. Her late father, in uniform, standing proudly beside a younger version of her. His smile was quiet, proud, certain. She whispered, "You always said the real test isn't planned. It's earned." The mess hall was alive with noise again that evening. It was Friday, the one day the soldiers could relax. Music hummed faintly from a portable speaker. Forks clattered, jokes bounced from table to table, and Mason, sitting with his usual crew, tried to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't. He could feel the pressure building. The men were restless, their pride bruised, their respect for leadership fractured. Then she walked in. Sarah Callan. Same calm walk, same unreadable face. She carried her tray, scanning the room, then quietly sat down at the same table she'd chosen her first day. The room fell quiet for just a second. Then the mocking started. Mason didn't join in this time, but the younger soldiers did. "Hey, Lieutenant," one called out. "You planning another surprise for us? Maybe you'll have us crawling through mud in the dark again?" Laughter rolled through the air. Sarah looked up, eyes sharp but composed. "If you performed your duties properly," she said, "you wouldn't need surprises." The laughter died. The soldier's smirk faltered. But Mason leaned forward, voice low and pointed. "With respect, ma'am, some of us don't need constant reminders of who's in charge." Sarah met his eyes. "Then act like it." The words hung in the air, cold and clear. Mason clenched his jaw, half standing, ready to say something more. Then it happened. The first alarm blared. A shrill, mechanical wail cut through the hall. Forks dropped. Heads turned. The red lights along the ceiling began to flash. Then came the second tone, lower, more urgent. The base-wide security alert. Everyone froze. Rhodes' voice crackled over the speaker system. "Attention all personnel. Unidentified intrusion detected at South Gate. All available units respond immediately." This is not a drill. Panic rippled through the room. Chairs scraped, boots pounded. Soldiers stumbled over each other in confusion. The smell of coffee and adrenaline filled the air. Sarah stood instantly. "Everyone out. Form your squads. Move." Her voice cut clean through the chaos. Command, clarity, authority. No one questioned her this time. Within seconds, the hall emptied into the main yard. Sarah was already on her radio, issuing orders. "Alpha, secure the south perimeter. Bravo, block the main road. Mason, take a team and get guns online." "Now," Mason blinked. "Lieutenant, go." She barked. He hesitated for half a heartbeat, then nodded and ran. The siren screamed louder as soldiers scrambled across the compound. Trucks started, gates slammed, radios buzzed. The base was alive, but disoriented. Sarah moved like a storm in control, weaving between squads, correcting formation errors, issuing clear, clipped commands. Watch your corners. Maintain radio silence unless confirmed. Her calmness under pressure spread like electricity. Panic turned into movement. Movement turned into order. Inside the control room, Rhodes watched her through the live feeds. "Damn," he whispered. "She's running it." Meanwhile, Mason reached the comms post. The system was half down, flooded with static. He grabbed a headset, shouting over the noise. "Bravo, confirm location. We've got zero visual on the breach." Static. Then a faint voice replied, "Negative contact? False alert?" Mason frowned. "Lieutenant, this doesn't look." Sarah's voice cut in over the channel, clear and firm. "It's a simulation, Sergeant. Treat it as real." For a moment, Mason just stared at the radio. Then he laughed softly, not mockingly, but in disbelief. She'd done it again. Back in the yard, the entire base moved like clockwork. The same soldiers who once laughed at her now sprinted under her orders, faces set with focus. She didn't shout for attention. She gave it through confidence. 25 minutes later, the red lights dimmed. The alarm stopped. Silence. Rhodes' voice came through again. "Exercise complete. All units stand down." Sarah lowered her radio and turned toward the soldiers gathering around her, breathing hard, sweat dripping down their necks. Mason jogged up, chest heaving. "You pulled another one on us," he said, half smiling, half exhausted. She met his eyes. "And you followed orders." The soldiers stood watching the two of them, the mockery gone from their faces. For the first time, they weren't looking at her like an outsider. They were looking at a leader. An hour later, the commander arrived, summoned by the sudden alarm. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded. Rhodes explained everything. How the drill had been launched without his direct authorization. How Lieutenant Callan had commanded the entire base through the chaos flawlessly. The commander turned to Sarah. "You did this?" "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment. "You realize you caused a full lockdown across a 40-acre installation?" "I do, sir." And every soldier responded faster than last week. Henderson's stern expression cracked into a small, unwilling smile. "You've got nerve, Lieutenant. And results. You might just be the shake-up this base needed." She saluted. "Thank you, sir." When he walked away, Mason approached her slowly. "You know," he said, "you scared the hell out of everyone." "That's what reality does," she replied quietly. That night, the base was quieter than usual. No laughter, no whispers, just exhaustion and reflection. Sarah sat in her office, sipping coffee, staring at the alert logs glowing on her screen. Her plan had worked, but it wasn't about victory. It was about respect through competence, not power. She thought of Mason, the soldiers, their faces shifting from arrogance to awareness. She didn't need their admiration. She needed their trust. Behind her, the door opened softly. Mason stepped in. "Lieutenant." She turned. He hesitated, then said, "I wanted to say, you handled that well. Better than I expected. Maybe better than any of us could have." She smiled faintly. "Thank you, Sergeant." "I still don't like surprises," he added. "I don't either," she replied, "but the enemy doesn't ask permission." Mason chuckled softly, nodded, and left. When the door closed, Sarah leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time, she felt the base had shifted, not completely, but enough. Somewhere deep inside Fort Bragg, the balance of respect was changing. The soldiers who once mocked her had obeyed her without question, and soon they would follow her without hesitation. The next morning dawned gray over Fort Bragg, the air thick with the promise of rain. The base moved slower than usual, soldiers dragging themselves to breakfast, heads bowed, voices low. Yesterday's drill had shaken them all, not because it was a false alarm, but because it had exposed every weakness they didn't know they had. And at the center of it all stood Lieutenant Sarah Cowan, the woman they had mocked only days before. She walked into the command briefing room with her usual calm stride. The officers seated around the table looked up, some curious, others cautious. Commander Henderson sat at the head, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "Lieutenant," he said, "you've made quite a name for yourself this week." Sarah stood straight. "I did what I thought was necessary, sir." He leaned forward. "Necessary, yes. Risky, definitely. But effective. I'll give you that. Your men responded faster, worked together better, and for the first time in months, no one questioned their orders." A faint murmur ran through the room. Henderson continued, "Still, you don't win trust in one drill. You build it. You earn it." Sarah nodded. "Understood, sir." He gave a thin smile. "Good, because you're about to get the chance to prove it." That chance came sooner than anyone expected. By mid-afternoon, the skies opened up. Rain slammed against the base, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Inside the hangar, Squad Bravo was prepping vehicles for a routine maintenance check. Mason was there, sleeves rolled up, joking with the mechanics. Then, a sudden crack split the air, followed by a sound no one wanted to hear. An explosion. The ground shook. Alarms blared. Fire burst from one of the fuel trucks near the storage depot. Flames shot upward, painting the stormy sky orange. Fuel tanks hit. Someone yelled, "We've got a rupture." Mason froze for half a second, then grabbed the radio. "Command, this is Bravo." Explosion at storage. Before he could finish, Sarah's voice cut through the static. "All units, this is Lieutenant Cowan. Evacuate the eastern sector immediately. Fire teams A and B, deploy to containment. Medic unit to Hangar 2. Mason, lock down the perimeter and reroute power lines now." There was no hesitation in her voice, only command. Within minutes, the base transformed into controlled chaos. Soldiers ran through sheets of rain, hauling hoses, shouting over the thunder. Trucks screeched into position. The fire spread faster than expected, licking at nearby generators, threatening to turn the entire depot into an inferno. Mason sprinted through the mud toward the main grid switch. Sparks flashed overhead as electrical lines popped. He cursed under his breath, grabbed the main lever, and yanked it down. The base lights flickered, then steadied. "Power diverted." He yelled into his comm. "Good work," Sarah replied. "Keep your men clear of the east line, the wind's shifting." He glanced up. Sure enough, the smoke was blowing their way. Her awareness was uncanny, like she could see every move happening at once. Meanwhile, Sarah was at the heart of the storm. She'd grabbed a fireproof jacket, clipped on her headset, and joined the containment line herself. The air burned with heat and gasoline. She shouted orders, helping to connect hoses, dragging a dazed soldier out of the danger zone. "Keep the pressure steady," she called. "Aim low, cut it off at the base." A young private slipped beside her, coughing. "Lieutenant, the valves jammed, pressure's building." Without hesitation, Sarah ran toward the valve station. The metal wheel glowed faintly from the heat. Her glove sizzled when she touched it. She gritted her teeth and forced it to turn, muscles trembling. Then, click. The wheel locked. The hissing stopped. Pressure contained. shouted the private. "Maintain line position," Sarah ordered, staggering back. Her face was streaked with rain, her hair soaked, but her eyes burned with purpose. Mason reached her seconds later, panting. "You're insane. You could have blown yourself up." She gave a half-smile. "You were supposed to handle power, Sergeant." "I did," he snapped. "But that was suicide. Leadership isn't sitting in a safe room while your men burn," she said, voice firm. "It's standing where they can see you, and still believe they'll make it." Mason stared at her for a long moment, rain dripping from his cap. Then, without a word, he turned back to help the others. The next 10 minutes were a blur of smoke, shouts, and roaring flames. But slowly, painfully, the fire began to die. Water soaked the earth, steam rising in thick clouds. By the time the storm eased, the inferno had turned into smoldering ruins. When it was over, silence fell. Sarah stood near the blackened remains of the truck, chest heaving, uniform stained with soot. Around her, soldiers looked to her, waiting for the next command, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Mason approached again, eyes softer this time. "We got lucky," he said quietly. "No," she replied, her gaze fixed on the wreck. "We got prepared." He followed her eyes. For the first time, he saw the base through her perspective. Every weakness, every blind spot, every moment that could have cost a life. She turned to the group and raised her voice. "Everyone, listen up." The exhausted soldiers straightened instinctively. Today wasn't about drills or orders. It was about trust. You proved that no matter the chaos, you can adapt, follow through, and protect each other. That's the difference between a squad and a family. There was no applause, no cheers, just quiet respect. And in that quiet, Mason noticed something else. No one was laughing at her anymore. Hours later, after the fire had been fully extinguished, Sarah sat in the commander's office. Henderson stood behind his desk, reviewing the reports. "No casualties," he said. "Minimal structural damage. You kept the fuel storage from exploding. That's a miracle in itself." Sarah stood silently. He looked up, his tone softening. "You saved the base, Lieutenant." "I can't ignore that. Just doing my job, sir." He smirked slightly. "You've got a habit of doing more than your job. The men see it. Mason sees it. They'll follow you now, whether they like it or not." She nodded. "Thank you, sir." "Get some rest," he added. "You've earned it." That night, as the rain finally stopped, Sarah walked alone past the smoking remains of the depot. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. The silence of the base was deep, the kind that came after something permanent had shifted. Mason found her there, standing near the burnt-out truck. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Neither could you." He shrugged. "Guess not. I keep replaying it in my head, the fire, the orders, the way you took control." "You all did," she said. "That's what leadership is supposed to look like, shared, not imposed." Mason chuckled softly. "You know, I used to think you were just another officer with an attitude. And now?" "Now," he said, glancing at the wreckage, "I think you're the reason we're still standing." Sarah didn't reply. She just looked toward the faint light breaking through the clouds. For the first time since she arrived, Fort Bragg wasn't just a post. It was a team, and she was at its center. The smoke had barely cleared from the depot when the first report hit Central Command in Washington. Words like unsanctioned drill, base-wide panic, and unauthorized leadership protocol lit up the communication channels. To bureaucrats behind desks, it wasn't heroism. It was insubordination wrapped in chaos. By Monday morning, Lieutenant Sarah Callan found herself sitting outside Commander Henderson's office once again. Her uniform was clean, her posture straight, but her eyes were shadowed from sleepless nights. The echoes of boots, voices, and ringing phones filled the corridor. Inside, Henderson's voice could be heard arguing, low at first, then rising. She prevented an explosion, for God's sake. You think I'm going to reprimand the one person who kept my men alive? A pause. Then a colder voice replied through the speakerphone. Protocol exists for a reason, Commander. You can't let a lieutenant bypass chain of command. Another pause. Henderson's sigh. If protocol cost us the base, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Moments later, the door opened. Lieutenant, he said. Inside. Sarah entered the office to find a live video feed on Henderson's monitor. A 2-star general from Central Command staring back. His nameplate read General Thomas Riker. He was old-school military, sharp, disciplined, allergic to deviation. Lieutenant Callan, Riker began, his tone clipped. I've reviewed your incident reports and field footage. I see initiative. I also see multiple violations of regulation. Sarah stood motionless. With respect, sir, regulations don't cover every situation. They're meant to, he said firmly. You launched a full-scale emergency protocol without clearance. You rerouted command channels. You risked men's lives. And saved them, she interrupted. The room went silent. Even Henderson froze. But Riker's expression didn't change. You're bold, Lieutenant. I'll give you that. But boldness without discipline is danger. This isn't about results. It's about order. Sarah met his stare. Order doesn't save soldiers. Leadership does. For a second, the general's lips tightened. Maybe irritation, maybe respect. It was impossible to tell. Finally, he said, effective immediately, Lieutenant Cowan, you are suspended pending review. Turn over your access codes and command files to Lieutenant Rhodes. Do you understand? Sarah didn't flinch. Yes, sir. Riker's image disappeared. The screen went dark. Henderson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Hell of a way to reward a hero. She managed a faint smile. It's easier to punish initiative than explain why it worked. He sighed. You'll get your chance to fight it, Callan. I'll back you, but right now, stay quiet. Let things cool. Word spread through the base within hours. Soldiers whispered as Sarah walked past. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away, unsure what to say. When she entered the mess hall, conversation stopped. It was a familiar silence, the same kind that had greeted her weeks ago when they first mocked her. Only this time, there was no laughter. Mason sat at the far end, watching her. He stood as she approached. Ma'am, he said softly. She gave a tired smile. You don't have to. I want to, he cut in. Everyone knows what happened. They're saying Washington doesn't care what you did, just how you did it. Sarah sighed, setting down her tray. That's the military, Sergeant. They want soldiers who obey, not ones who think. Mason frowned. Then maybe it's time they start thinking too. The next few days were long and uneasy. Without Sarah's steady presence, the base felt hollow. Orders were slower. Drills lacked energy. Soldiers argued over small things again. Rhodes tried to fill her shoes, but even he admitted quietly that it wasn't the same. She made people sharper, he told Henderson. Now it's like we're back to routine, efficient, but lifeless. Henderson grunted. The problem with people like her is they remind everyone what leadership actually looks like. Makes the rest of us look lazy. That Friday, a transport convoy was scheduled to move through the outer ridge, a routine operation. Sarah wasn't supposed to be there. Her clearance had been frozen. Still, as the trucks rumbled out of the gate, something felt wrong. From her temporary quarters, She noticed movement in the distance. Too many lights flickering in the tree line near the convoy path. Her instincts screamed. She grabbed her radio, only to remember it was locked. She cursed, then ran straight to the control post. "Lieutenant, you're not authorized," the guard began, but she brushed past him, eyes on the radar. There it was, multiple heat signatures approaching the convoy route fast. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest line to Rhodes. "You've got contact on Route Delta. Possible ambush? Repeat, possible ambush. Pull the convoy back now." Rhodes' startled voice came through. "Callan, you're not. Do it." She snapped. He didn't argue. Seconds later, the command vehicle screeched to a halt. Mason, who was leading the escort, shouted into his mic. "Convoy halt. Defensive perimeter." The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Blank rounds, training simulation rounds. But the soldiers didn't know that yet. Sarah's heart dropped. Another drill. Another unannounced test from command. And no one had told her. She listened as the soldiers scrambled into defensive positions, confusion spreading. The simulation was designed to measure reaction time, and they were failing. Without authorization, she stormed into the operations room, grabbed the mic, and barked, "All units, left flank, push 20 meters. Suppression fire. Bravo, move south. Mason, get those trucks behind cover." There was a brief silence, then movement. Radios crackled with renewed coordination. Through the monitors, she watched the chaos turn into rhythm. The soldiers responded perfectly, almost instinctively, as if her voice alone carried clarity. Within 10 minutes, the exercise ended. The attackers retreated. Moments later, the phone on her desk rang. Henderson's voice came through, low and measured. "You realize what you've just done?" "Yes, sir," she said evenly. "I prevented another disaster. You also just broke your suspension." "I saved your convoy," she replied. Again, there was silence on the line. Then he said, "Stay put, Callan." When he arrived 15 minutes later, he didn't look angry. If anything, he looked conflicted. "The general's going to hear about this," he said quietly. "I'm counting on it." He studied her. "You knew it was a drill, didn't you?" "Not at first," she admitted. "But whether it was live fire or blanks doesn't matter. My people were in danger. I reacted." Henderson nodded slowly. "And they reacted to you. Not to Rhodes. Not to me. To you." He sighed. "You're changing this place, Callan. For better or worse, I can't tell yet." That night, as the convoy returned safely, Mason stopped by her quarters. He didn't knock, just leaned against the doorframe. "You've got guts," he said, and apparently no intention of following orders. She smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard." He stepped inside. "You know they're going to try to make you the problem now. Too independent. Too unpredictable." "I know. Then why keep fighting?" She looked at him for a long moment, her voice soft. "Because someday, one of these soldiers is going to have to make a decision without waiting for permission. And when they do, I want them to know how." Mason nodded slowly. "You really think one person can change the system?" Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't about pride, but belief. "Maybe not the system, but I can change the people who'll run it next." Outside, the base lights flickered in the wind. For the first time, Mason realized something. Sarah Callan wasn't just controlling a base anymore. She was building an army that thought, and that terrified the people above her more than anything else. 3 days later, the sound of rotors cut through the dawn air at Fort Bragg. A Black Hawk helicopter descended onto the parade ground, its blades slicing the mist like knives. Soldiers stood at attention along the edge of the tarmac, their uniforms crisp, but their eyes uneasy. Word had spread fast. General Thomas Riker was coming. Not through reports, not through video calls, but in person. When the helicopter touched down, the side door opened, and out stepped the man himself, tall, broad-shouldered, his metals gleaming like cold sunlight. He didn't smile. He didn't shake hands. He simply looked around, his gaze scanning every corner of the base with military precision. Beside him walked Commander Henderson, trying to match his pace. "General," Henderson began, "I assure you." Riker raised a hand to silence him. "I'll see it for myself." Sarah Callan watched from the distance. She was standing near the training yard, dressed in plain fatigues, technically still suspended, but unable to stay idle. The soldiers nearby whispered, nervous energy passing between them. Mason approached quietly. "He's here for you, I know. You should prepare for." "No," she said softly. "You can't prepare for people like him. You face them." Mason exhaled. "He's not coming to talk, Callan. He's coming to end you." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Then he'd better bring something stronger than fear." By noon, the base assembled in the main hangar for what was called an inspection briefing, though everyone knew it was something else entirely. Riker stood on the small stage, Henderson beside him, and a sea of soldiers below, their boots echoing on concrete. "Men and women of Fort Bragg," Riker began, voice sharp and commanding. "I've read your reports. I've seen your response times. Impressive improvements in the last month, but also a disturbing lack of adherence to protocol." He paused, letting the words sink in. "There is a fine line between initiative and insubordination. Some of you seem to have forgotten that." No one moved. Then his eyes landed on Sarah, standing quietly in the back row. Lieutenant Callan. Front and center. The hangar seemed to inhale. Sarah stepped forward, her boots echoing across the floor, until she stood before him, straight-backed, calm, unflinching. Riker studied her like a surgeon examining a patient. "You've become something of a legend here," he said finally. "They say you've saved this base twice. They also say you defied every rule written to do it." "I followed the rule that matters most, sir," she replied evenly. "Protect your people." He circled her slowly. "And who protects them from you, Lieutenant? When soldiers start worshiping a single voice, discipline dies. We don't need heroes. We need soldiers." Sarah didn't look away. "Then maybe you've forgotten what kind of people heroes used to be." A ripple ran through the crowd, a mix of admiration and fear. Riker stopped in front of her again. "You think leadership is about disobedience?" "No, sir," she said. "It's about judgment. And courage when judgment isn't enough." He smirked faintly. "Careful, Lieutenant. Courage sounds poetic until it gets men killed." "Then maybe the problem isn't courage," she said quietly. "Maybe it's leaders who confuse silence with safety." The silence that followed was electric. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Mason clenched his jaw. Riker's eyes hardened. That night, the general ordered a closed-door meeting. Only senior staff were allowed, but everyone knew what it meant. A decision was coming. Henderson tried to reason with him. "She's the best field leader I've seen in a decade. Her people would walk through fire for her, literally." Riker's reply was cold. "That's the problem, Commander. She's teaching them loyalty to a person, not to command. You think that's leadership? I think that's a cult." "You're wrong," Henderson said. "She's the reason this base is functional. Morale's higher than ever." Riker leaned forward. "And what happens when she decides she knows better than orders again? You want that kind of wild card in wartime?" Henderson didn't answer. Riker stood, buttoning his jacket. "As of tomorrow morning, I'll be reassigning her, quietly, far from here. You'll announce it as a transfer. End of discussion. But word never stayed quiet at Fort Bragg. By dawn, everyone knew. Sarah was being removed. No ceremony. No farewell. Just gone. Mason found her by the motor pool, sitting on a crate, staring at the rising sun. Her duffel bag sat at her feet. "So that's it?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Seems so." He frowned. "You're not fighting this?" She looked out toward the training grounds, where soldiers were already running drills she'd designed, shouting orders she'd taught. "I already did. Every time I made them better." Mason shook his head. "You changed this place. You made us more than soldiers. You made us think." She chuckled softly. "That's exactly what got me in trouble." He knelt beside her. "Then let them take your rank. They can't take what you gave us." She looked at him, really looked. "You're going to make a good leader, Mason." "Because of you," he said. At 0900 hours, the entire base was assembled again, this time under the guise of a personnel announcement. Riker stood before them, Henderson beside him, and Sarah off to the side. "Effective immediately," Riker announced, "Lieutenant Sarah Cowan will be reassigned to the Northern Tactical Division. Her service here is concluded." Murmurs rippled through the ranks. No one applauded. No one saluted. Then Mason stepped forward from formation. "Permission to speak, sir." Riker's eyes narrowed. "Denied." Mason ignored him. "With respect, sir, we don't let heroes walk out without acknowledgement." A dozen heads turned. Riker's face reddened. "Sergeant, that's an order." But Mason kept going. "She didn't just lead us. She rebuilt us. She taught us to act, not wait. To think, not obey blindly." Riker took a step forward. "Sergeant Mason, one more word and then it happened." Another soldier stepped out. Then another. And another. Within seconds, half the hangar had broken formation. They stood behind Sarah, silent but firm, not defying the general, but standing with her. Riker froze. His authority, his presence, both crumbling in real time. Henderson, watching from the side, whispered under his breath, "My God." Sarah looked around at the faces before her. Wet eyes, clenched jaws, unwavering loyalty. She wanted to tell them to fall back, to avoid punishment, but her throat tightened. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "Back in line, soldiers." "That's an order." They hesitated, then obeyed. Not because of fear, because of respect. She turned to Riker. "You see, sir? They still follow orders. They just choose who they respect." Riker's jaw clenched. "Get her on that helicopter." Hours later, as the Black Hawk lifted off, Sarah looked down at Fort Bragg, her soldiers standing in formation, motionless, watching until she disappeared into the clouds. Mason stood at the front of the line, hand raised in salute. For the first time in years, Riker's base had discipline, but it also had something he couldn't control: belief. And belief, once sparked, never dies. That night, Henderson stood in his office, watching the quiet base through the window. Rhodes entered. "Sir, are we just going to let her go?" Henderson didn't answer immediately. Then he turned, a small smile ghosting across his face. "No, not yet. You don't bury a spark like that. You keep it alive until you need it most." Far above, the helicopter cut through the last light of dusk. Sarah sat quietly, wind pressing against the cabin windows. She didn't know where they were taking her, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the pause before the next battle. The Northern Tactical Division sat buried in the heart of the Montana wilderness, far from the heat and hum of Fort Bragg. Snow blanketed the vast training grounds, and the icy wind carried a silence sharper than any blade. Sarah Cowan stepped off the helicopter into that frozen quiet, her duffel slung over her shoulder. No welcoming committee, no ceremony. Just a single soldier in a thick parka waiting at the gate. "Lieutenant Callan?" The man asked, his tone stiff. "That's me. Sergeant Lewis. I've been assigned to show you your quarters." His expression gave away nothing, but Sarah could sense it. The way his eyes avoided hers. The subtle tension in his jaw. She wasn't here to lead. She was here to disappear. Her quarters were cold and bare. A steel-framed bed, one desk, one chair. No insignia, no photos, nothing human. It was isolation in uniform form. For the next few weeks, she followed orders quietly. She attended briefings, observed exercises, and did what she was told. Nothing more, nothing less. But she saw it almost immediately. This division was fractured. Commanders barking orders with no strategy. Teams competing instead of collaborating. Recruits exhausted from confusion, not combat. And beneath it all, fear. They were fighting each other, not a common goal. One evening, as she left the training yard, she overheard two soldiers arguing by the armory. "Lewis, I'm telling you, it's suicide," one of them said. "We can't move supplies through that pass. It's unstable." "Orders are orders," Lewis replied bitterly. "You disobey, you're gone." Sarah stepped closer. "What pass?" They stiffened. "Ma'am, it's not your concern." "Everything dangerous on this base is my concern," she said quietly. Lewis sighed. "They're sending a convoy through Raven Pass. A storm's coming. Heavy snow, zero visibility. But command insists the mission must proceed. We've already lost 2 trucks last year doing the same thing." Sarah frowned. "Who approved it?" "Major Kellen," Lewis said grimly. "And no one dares question him." That name sent a spark through her mind. She'd heard of Kellen, ruthless, by the book, the kind of officer who measured loyalty by obedience, not results. She thanked them and walked off, but the decision was already forming in her head. She couldn't just stand by again. The next morning, she found Kellen in the ops tent, studying a map. "Major," she said evenly, "about the Raven Pass mission." He didn't look up. "Not your assignment, Lieutenant." "With respect, sir, the route's unstable. Sending trucks through during a storm isn't your call." She took a step forward. "Sir, at least let me run recon before they depart." He finally looked up, cold, dismissive. "You're here because you disobeyed orders at Bragg, Callan. Don't think I don't know your file. You may have impressed Riker, but this is my command. You follow my rules or you're done." He turned back to the map. She stood there for a moment, jaw tight. "Understood, sir." That night, as snow began to fall, the convoy rolled out. 3 transport trucks, 12 soldiers, and a promise of disaster. Sarah sat awake in her quarters, staring at the radio on her desk. Static crackled through the speakers, punctuated by brief bursts of chatter. Then she heard it, the tremor in a voice. "Alpha 3 to base, visibility down to 15 feet. Roads iced. We can't, static." Then another voice, strained with panic. "Truck 2's gone off the ridge. Repeat, we've lost the truck." Sarah was already moving. She grabbed her coat, radio, and sidearm, and sprinted toward the motor pool. Lewis was there, fumbling with his gloves. "You heard it too? Get a team ready. We're going." He hesitated. "Ma'am," Kellen said. "I said we're going." Her voice cut through the storm like thunder. An hour later, they were deep in the mountain pass. Snow whipped across the headlights, blinding white sheets swallowing everything. "Keep your line tight," Sarah shouted over the wind. "Watch for the edge." They found the first truck halfway down the ravine, twisted metal half buried in snow. 2 men alive, 1 trapped. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, hands raw from cold. "Hold still," she said, prying at the bent door. He groaned. "We shouldn't have come." "I know," she said. "But you're getting out." Lewis and another soldier joined her, and after several grueling minutes, they freed him. "Get them in the transport," she yelled. Just then, a deafening crack echoed across the mountains. The snow beneath them trembled. "Avalanche!" Someone shouted. Sarah looked up, a wall of white roaring toward them. "Move!" she screamed. They dove behind the trucks as the avalanche thundered down, shaking the ground like an earthquake. When it stopped, the world went silent again, buried under snow and breathless shock. They were stranded for 6 hours, radios dead, vehicles half buried, but they were alive. When rescue finally came, Kellen was waiting at the base, face red with fury. "You had no authorization to leave," he shouted the moment she stepped off the truck. "You jeopardized military property." Sarah walked right up to him, eyes blazing. "I saved your men. You disobeyed a direct, and they would have died obeying yours," she snapped. The words hit like a bullet. Soldiers nearby stopped what they were doing, their eyes flicking between the two. Kellen took a step closer, voice low. "You're finished, Cowan. You'll be discharged by morning." She didn't flinch. "Then at least I'll go knowing I saved them. Can you say the same?" He glared at her for a long moment and stormed away. That night, she sat outside the barracks, the storm finally dying down. Lewis approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "They're all alive," he said softly. "If it wasn't for you," she shook her head. "They just needed someone to choose them over paperwork." He handed her a cup. "You know, word's spreading again. The soldiers here, they're starting to talk. About how you went out there when command froze. About how you led when no one else dared." She gave a tired smile. "That's how trouble starts." "Maybe," Lewis said. "Or maybe that's how change starts." 2 days later, an encrypted message arrived at the base. Henderson's signature flashed on the screen. Classified, Priority Directive Lieutenant Sarah Cowan, to remain under observation. General Riker requests full operational report from Montana. He is en route. Sarah stared at the message, her heartbeat steady, so he was coming again. But this time, she wasn't the same soldier who'd been silenced at Fort Bragg. This time, she had proof. Proof that command's blind obedience had nearly killed good men, and that leadership wasn't about fear, but courage. As snow continued to fall outside, she whispered to herself, "Let him come." When dawn came, the sky burned orange over the frozen peaks. The entire base moved like an exposed nerve, tense, alert, expectant. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of rotors echoed again. The Black Hawk was back, and Sarah Cowan, standing tall against the wind, was ready to face the man who once tried to erase her. The storm had cleared by the time General Thomas Riker's helicopter appeared over the ridge. The sunrise caught its steel belly, flashing briefly like lightning against the white Montana sky. Soldiers gathered near the landing pad, bracing against the cold, their breath fogging in the frozen air. But it wasn't the general they were waiting for this time. It was her, Lieutenant Sarah Cowan. She stood near the operations tent, hands behind her back, her uniform crisp, but her expression unreadable. Snow crunched under the boots of the arriving escort team. The moment the rotors slowed, Riker stepped out, flanked by 2 aides, his presence slicing through the silence like a knife. He looked around, taking in the base, the tension in the air, the soldiers' guarded glances. He already felt it. Control had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Inside the main hangar, a table had been set up with mission logs, communication reports, and tactical maps. Sarah waited as Riker strode in, every movement deliberate, his authority radiating like cold heat. "Lieutenant Cowan," he began without preamble, "you've made quite an impression here, again. Only doing what was necessary, sir." Riker's eyes narrowed. What was necessary was following orders. You took it upon yourself to launch an unsanctioned rescue in hostile conditions directly against command, and saved 12 lives doing it, she said, voice firm. He studied her for a long moment. Always the savior, aren't you? She didn't answer. He circled the table, picking up the mission report Henderson had forwarded. You've defied every rule of military hierarchy, and yet, somehow, everywhere you go, people start listening to you instead of their superiors. Do you know what that looks like from my chair? Sarah met his gaze. It looks like leadership. He slammed the report down. It looks like mutiny. The sound echoed through the hangar. Soldiers outside stopped moving, sensing the confrontation through the thin metal walls. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moaning through the rafters. Then Sarah spoke, her voice quiet but strong. Sir, permission to speak freely. Riker crossed his arms. You always do anyway. She stepped forward. I've seen soldiers die waiting for perfect orders. I've seen morale die faster than men because leaders were too afraid to be wrong. What happened here, what happened at Bragg, wasn't rebellion. It was what the Army used to stand for: judgment, initiative, and loyalty to the mission, not the ego behind it. Riker stared at her, his jaw tight. You want soldiers who don't question, sir? She continued. Then you'll get exactly that. Soldiers who freeze, who fail, who follow orders straight into graves. I'd rather lead a team that disobeys to save lives than one that obeys to watch them die. The words hung heavy in the air. One of Riker's aides, a young captain, broke the silence nervously. Sir, the men from the convoy are ready for debriefing. Should I? Riker raised a hand to silence him, his eyes never leaving Sarah. Dismissed. The aide hesitated, then left quickly. Riker moved closer, lowering his voice. You think you're changing the system, Callan. But you're only proving why the system exists. You can't build an army on feeling. You can't win wars without it either, she said. Orders don't pull a bleeding soldier from a truck. People do. Riker exhaled slowly. You always have an answer. Only because you keep asking the wrong questions. For the first time, a faint, reluctant smirk crossed his lips, gone in an instant, but there. You know, most officers would crumble under this kind of pressure. But you thrive on it. Pressure's just truth's way of checking if you're serious, she replied. Riker turned and walked to the window, looking out at the training field. Below, soldiers were running drills, tighter, sharper, more focused than any report could describe. He'd come expecting to find chaos. Instead, he found discipline, but of a different kind. It wasn't fear-driven. It was earned. He could see it now. When Sarah passed through, men straightened. Women saluted with pride, not obligation. This wasn't defiance. It was belief. And that was more dangerous and more powerful than any mutiny. He turned back. You've rebuilt this base in a month. I didn't rebuild it, she said simply. They did. I just reminded them what they could be. The door opened again. Henderson walked in, snow dusting his shoulders. General, Lieutenant. Riker gave a curt nod. I didn't call you here, Commander. I know, Henderson said. But I figured you'd want to see this. He handed Riker a small tablet. On it, video footage from the rescue mission. Helmet cams, timestamps, come chatter. Riker watched silently. The images were brutal. Blinding snow, overturned trucks, soldiers trapped in twisted metal. And then, through it all, Sarah, leading the charge, pulling men from wreckage, calling out orders, keeping her team calm under crushing conditions. When it ended, Riker set the tablet down carefully. How many casualties? None, Henderson said quietly. All 12 made it back. Riker looked at Sarah again, but his expression had changed. There was no anger this time, only something closer to respect. He turned to Henderson. "You believe in her, don't you?" Henderson smiled faintly. "I believed in what she made the rest of us remember. That the uniform doesn't make the soldier. The choices do." Riker stood there for a long time. Then, slowly, he unpinned his gloves and set them on the table. "Lieutenant Cowan," he said, voice softer now, "you've broken more regulations in 6 months than most officers do in their careers. You've embarrassed superiors, bent chains of command, and refused to back down even when you should have." He stepped closer. "And yet," he extended a small rectangular badge from his coat pocket. Silver, engraved with the eagle crest of the United States Army. "You've done what I couldn't. You made them remember why we serve." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Sir?" Riker handed her the badge. "Effective immediately. You're promoted to captain. You'll take command of the Northern Tactical Division. Consider this. My apology for underestimating you." For the first time, Sarah couldn't find words. The soldiers outside, watching through the open hangar doors, erupted in stunned whispers. She straightened. "Thank you, sir. But I didn't do it alone." "I know," Riker said. "That's exactly why you earned it." Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Sarah stood outside the barracks, the wind cold but no longer cruel. Mason had arrived from Fort Bragg with a small team sent under Riker's new directive. When he saw her, his face lit up. "Captain Cowan, huh? Has a nice ring to it." She smiled. "Don't get used to it. Titles don't change what we do." He grinned. "Maybe not. But they change who listens when we speak." She looked out over the snow-covered field where new recruits were training, her recruits now. The sound of their shouted drills echoed like music through the valley. "It's funny," she said quietly. "They mocked me once for eating alone in a mess hall." Mason tilted his head. "And now?" She looked at him, eyes fierce, calm, alive. "Now the whole base eats because we refuse to stay silent." That night, Riker boarded his helicopter for the return trip. As it lifted off, he glanced out the window at the base below. Alive, unified, efficient. He didn't smile, but there was a hint of pride in his eyes. He muttered to himself, "Maybe the Army still has a few leaders left worth following." And far below, under the glowing floodlights of the Montana wilderness, Captain Sarah Cowan stood alone for a moment. The cold biting at her cheeks, the stars stretching endless above. Her path hadn't been easy. She had been mocked, tested, threatened, and nearly broken. But she had learned one thing: control wasn't about command. It was about conviction. And in the end, that conviction had turned her from the woman they mocked into the leader they all followed.